Hi there, and welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's story begins on the edge of St. Mary Mead, where an old lantern burns each night by the gate of a long-forgotten house. No one remembers who lights it. No one dares to ask why it never goes out. But when a villager disappears on a foggy evening, and the lantern's flame is found burning brighter than ever before, Miss Marple feels the chill of something more than superstition. Each clue leads her closer to a secret buried beneath the ivy, a story of guilt, promise, and a truth that refused to stay in the dark. Because sometimes the light that guides us home is the very thing that marks where we're meant to be found. Stay with us till the end. And if you love mysteries that glow softly with danger and memory, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Haunting Vales. Chapter 1. The Lantern That Waited by the Gate. The wind rolled across the fields of Devon like a whisper that refused to die. It carried with it the smell of rain and the faint creak of something swinging in the dark. At the far end of the narrow country lane stood a tall iron gate, blackened with age. Hanging from one of its rusted hooks was a lantern, still lit, though the storm had nearly drowned out every light for miles. The flame inside flickered weakly, bending to the wind but never dying. It had been burning since dusk, though no one in the village could say who had lit it or why. By the time Miss Marple's cab turned up the lane, the rain had thinned into a fine mist, silver in the headlights. The driver glanced nervously through the windscreen. "Strange thing, that light," he muttered. "Been there 3 nights running. Always at the same hour. Folks say it's bad luck." Miss Marple, sitting primly in the back seat, leaned forward, her gloved hands resting neatly on her handbag. "Bad luck," she repeated softly. "Or perhaps just bad timing." The driver gave a small laugh, unsure whether she was joking. "No one goes up that way anymore, ma'am. The house beyond the gate, Hawthorne Grange, has been empty for years, since old Mr. Lacey passed." Miss Marple's eyes lifted toward the light. "Empty houses," she said, "have a way of not staying empty for long." The cab slowed as they approached the gate. The lantern swung slightly, as if nodding in greeting. Beyond it, the drive stretched into a tunnel of bare trees, their branches clawing at the mist. Miss Marple asked the driver to stop. She stepped out carefully, her small umbrella opening with a practiced snap. The ground beneath her shoes was soft and uneven. "Will you wait for me?" she asked gently. The driver hesitated, then nodded. "Not for long, if it's all the same to you." "That will do perfectly," said Miss Marple. She walked to the gate. The lantern's light caught the edges of her face, softening the wrinkles, warming the cool gray of her eyes. She studied it closely. The wick had been trimmed. The oil was fresh. Someone had lit it not long ago. She looked up the drive. The mist seemed thicker there, folding around the trees. Somewhere deep in the distance, a single window glimmered faintly in the old house. Miss Marple was in Devon on invitation. The vicar's wife from St. Mary Mead had introduced her to an old acquaintance, Mrs. Clara Henson, who had written a most curious letter. It spoke of noises at night, of strange lights on the lawn, and a feeling that she was not alone in the house. Miss Marple had read it twice and decided that sometimes old women must look after one another. When she arrived at Hawthorne Grange, Mrs. Henson was waiting by the door, her shawl pulled tightly around her thin shoulders. "Oh, Miss Marple, I do hope the journey wasn't dreadful. I'm so grateful you came. It's this business with the lantern. It's been dreadful." "Not dreadful, I should think," Miss Marple said kindly, "but perhaps unsettling." Mrs. Henson nodded. "Yes. It began after the gardener left. He used to bring the post, light the fires, that sort of thing. But since he went, I've seen lights at the gate. Always at 9:30. The same time my husband used to come home years ago." Miss Marple took off her damp gloves. "And you're certain it's not some passing traveler?" Mrs. Henson shook her head. No one uses that road. Not since the bridge collapsed. There's nowhere to go beyond the Grange. May I see the view from upstairs? Miss Marple asked, where the gate is visible. Mrs. Henson led her up a winding staircase. The house smelled of dust and lavender polish. In the drawing room, an old clock ticked steadily, its sound far too loud for the silence around it. From the window, Miss Marple could see the faint outline of the gate below. The lantern was still burning. The light cast a long golden path across the wet grass. "You see," said Mrs. Henson in a trembling voice. "There is again. No one touches it, yet it burns every night." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do you keep any oil for lamps in the house?" Mrs. Henson nodded. "A few bottles in the cellar. I checked them. None are missing." Miss Marple watched the flames sway in the wind. "Then whoever lights it brings their own." The rain began again after supper. Miss Marple sat by the fire, knitting quietly. Mrs. Henson paced the rug in small nervous circles. At exactly 9:30, the clock struck. Miss Marple looked up. "Shall we see?" Mrs. Henson went to the window. "There! Again!" Sure enough, the lantern glowed at the gate, steady and bright. Miss Marple set her knitting down and rose. "Would you be kind enough to fetch me a coat, Mrs. Henson? I should like to have a closer look." Mrs. Henson's eyes widened. "At this hour? Oh, no, Miss Marple, you can't." But Miss Marple was already buttoning her coat. "Fear," she said softly, "is very good at keeping secrets, but light is better at finding them." The walk to the gate felt longer in the dark. The path was slick with mud, the trees shivering under the weight of rain. Miss Marple's small lamp cast a weak glow ahead, just enough to see the puddles glinting underfoot. When she reached the gate, the old iron hinges groaned softly. The lantern still burned, just as before. She studied the ground. Someone had been here recently. There were footprints, fresh and distinct, though half washed away by rain. They led from the road to the gate, but stopped abruptly, as if the person had vanished into thin air. Miss Marple bent closer. The prints were small, lighter than a man's weight. A woman's shoes, perhaps. She turned the lantern gently. On the side facing away from the house, there was a mark scratched into the metal. Not a name, but 2 letters, C.H. Clara Henson. Miss Marple frowned slightly. She turned to look back at the house. The upper windows were dark now. Only the drawing room fire gave off a faint orange glow. If Mrs. Henson had not lit the lantern, and if the gardener had left, then who had? She touched the metal. It was still warm. By morning, the storm had passed. Mist still clung to the fields, but the air felt lighter somehow. Miss Marple took her tea by the window. Mrs. Henson hadn't slept. Her eyes were shadowed, her hands trembling slightly as she poured the milk. "You went out there, didn't you?" she asked quietly. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and I found something curious. Your initials scratched into the lantern." Mrs. Henson stared. "Mine? That's impossible. I've never even touched it." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Memory plays tricks, dear. Sometimes we do things without remembering." But Mrs. Henson shook her head firmly. "No, I remember perfectly. That lantern belonged to my husband. He kept it in the shed. After he passed, I put it away." "Where?" "In the cellar." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Then perhaps," she said, "someone else has been visiting your cellar." They went down together. The cellar door creaked as Miss Marple pushed it open. The air inside was damp and cold. Shelves of old tools lined the walls, paint tins, ropes, a broken chair. But one thing was missing. "There," said Mrs. Henson. "That's where the lantern was." A faint patch of clean wood showed where it had once sat. Miss Marple examined the space carefully. "No dust. It was moved quite recently." Mrs. Henson clutched her shawl tighter. "You think someone's been in the house?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that someone has been trying to be seen. Later that afternoon, a young man arrived at the door. He introduced himself as Inspector Rowe from the local station. His expression was polite but curious. "I hear you've had some trouble with trespassers, Mrs. Henson," he said. A few of the villagers mentioned a light at the gate. Miss Marple listened quietly as he spoke. Mrs. Henson nodded. "Yes, every night for 3 days." Miss Marple saw it herself. Rowe turned toward her. "Did you indeed, ma'am?" "Yes," she said, "and I think whoever is responsible wants you to notice. They are leaving a message, Inspector, but not for us." He frowned. "Then for who?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "For someone who hasn't come home yet." That evening, as the sun dipped below the hedgerows, Miss Marple sat by the fire again, knitting her quiet patterns. She thought of the initials on the lantern, of the footprints, and of the steady light that burned against the dark. People left signs for all sorts of reasons, grief, guilt, or longing, but they rarely left them for strangers to find. She looked toward the window. The sky outside had turned the color of bruised lilac. Any minute now, the clock would strike 9:30, and she knew the light would return. Chapter 2: The Footprints Beneath the Lantern. The next morning brought with it a thin gray light that did little to warm the world. Mist still hung low over the fields, wrapping the hedgerows like a pale shroud. Miss Marple stood at the upstairs window of Hawthorne Grange, her teacup cooling in her hands. The gate was visible through the drifting fog, and though the lantern was now dark, she could almost imagine it still burning, patient, watchful, waiting for dusk. Behind her, Mrs. Henson moved quietly about the room. She looked smaller than before, her posture slightly bent, as if the weight of the previous night's fear had pressed down on her shoulders. "Did you sleep at all?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Henson shook her head. "Every sound made me think someone was moving about the house. Once, I could have sworn I heard the cellar door." Miss Marple nodded. The imagination can be most unkind when one feels alone. But sometimes it is not imagination at all. Mrs. Henson's hands trembled slightly as she poured more tea. "You truly believe someone is coming here?" "Every night. I believe someone is drawn here," Miss Marple replied. "And until we know why, they will continue to come." Later that morning, Inspector Rowe returned. He was a practical man, brisk and polite, with a habit of smoothing his hair whenever he spoke. "We've had a look round the grounds," he said, standing in the hall. "No signs of forced entry. No clear footprints now. Last night's rain washed them away." Miss Marple tilted her head. "But there were footprints, you recall. Small ones." "Yes, ma'am. You noticed that yourself." She smiled faintly. "Indeed. In the direction, they led toward the house, not away. Which means our visitor didn't just light the lantern and vanish. They came closer." Inspector Rowe frowned. "Perhaps a child, then? Mischief from the village." Miss Marple's expression softened. Children seldom repeat mischief 3 nights in a row, especially in a storm. "No, Inspector, I think whoever lights that lantern has a purpose." By noon, the rain began again, light and steady, tapping against the windows. Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Henson in the drawing room, their tea untouched. The air in the old house carried an unease that seemed to move through every corridor. Even the clock on the mantel ticked slower, as if it, too, was waiting. "Did your husband ever speak of the lantern?" Miss Marple asked at last. Mrs. Henson looked up, startled by the question. "Yes, once or twice. He kept it by the gate when we were first married. Said it helped him find his way home from the village on foggy nights." "Did anyone else know of this habit?" "Only the old gardener, and perhaps his brother. He visited from time to time before the quarrel." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap. "Quarrel?" "Yes, about money. My husband had lent him a sum, and when he couldn't repay it, there were harsh words. They never spoke again." "And where is the brother now?" Mrs. Henson hesitated. He left the county. No one's heard of him for years. Miss Marple sighs, sharp beneath her gentle expression, watched the firelight flicker. People do have a way of returning, she said softly, when guilt keeps them wandering. That evening, the wind rose once more, carrying with it the distant cry of owls and the rustle of branches against the roof. Miss Marple had taken a small stool near the window. Her lamp was turned low, so the light inside would not betray her watching. Mrs. Henson had gone to bed early, worn out by nerves, though Miss Marple suspected she was lying awake in her room, listening for the first sound of the clock. When it came, the slow, echoing toll of 9:30, Miss Marple held her breath. And then she saw it. The lantern flared to life at the gate. A shadow stood beside it, faint, wavering, but unmistakably human. The figure bent slightly, as though tending to the flame. Then it stepped back, lingering near the gatepost, unmoving. Miss Marple strained her eyes. The mist was thick, the light dim, but she could make out the shape, small, slight, perhaps a woman. Then, just as quietly as it had appeared, the shadow turned and slipped into the trees beyond the lane. Miss Marple waited until the light of the lantern steadied again before she rose. She took her walking stick and shawl, careful not to wake Mrs. Henson, and stepped into the hall. The floorboards creaked beneath her sensible shoes. When she opened the front door, the cold air hit her like a breath from another world. The path to the gate gleamed with rain, a faint reflection of the lantern guiding her way. She moved slowly, her eyes alert, her steps measured. When she reached the gate, the flame flickered in greeting, as though aware of her presence. She bent close, examining the ground. This time, the mud was soft and thick enough to hold the shape of the footprints clearly. There they were, small feet, turned slightly inward, walking not from the road, but from the woods behind the house. She followed them carefully with the light of her torch. They curved along the hedge, past the old shed, and stopped by the rear fence, where a small section of wire had been cut away. Someone had been coming in from the forest every night. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught something glinting near the hole, a piece of cloth caught on a thorn. She reached out and tugged it free. It was a torn corner of shawl, soaked with rain and faintly scented of lavender. She frowned. Mrs. Henson also wore lavender, but this thread was darker, older somehow, faded to gray. She slipped it into her pocket and turned back toward the house. The lantern still burned behind her, the light swaying like a heartbeat in the wind. When she entered the drawing room again, she found Mrs. Henson standing by the fire, pale and frightened. "I heard you go out," she whispered. "I couldn't sleep." Miss Marple nodded, unwrapping her shawl. "Then I'll tell you plainly. Someone has been entering your property from the forest. The footprints come from there, not the road." Mrs. Henson pressed a hand to her chest. "But who would—" "I don't know yet," said Miss Marple. "But they are not here to harm you. If they wished to, they would have done so already." Mrs. Henson sank into the nearest chair. "Then why? Why the lantern?" Miss Marple looked toward the darkened window. "Because it's a signal, and signals are only sent when there's someone meant to see them." The next day, Miss Marple paid a visit to the village. The small post office smelled faintly of tobacco and damp paper. The postmistress, a woman with sharp eyes and a warm voice, recognized her at once. "From Hawthorne Grange, aren't you? You'll be staying with poor Mrs. Henson, I expect." "Yes," Miss Marple said kindly. "Tell me, have there been any strangers about lately?" The woman hesitated. "Well, there's a lady who's been asking after the Grange. Came by a week ago. Thin thing, with a limp. Said she used to know the Lacys years ago. Didn't give her name. Did she post anything?" "Just a letter. No return address." Miss Marple smiled politely, thanked her, and left. But inside, her mind was already at work. A woman with a limp. A letter without return. A lantern that burned at the hour a husband once came home. It was beginning to form a picture, one painted not in bold colors, but in soft, lonely shades. That night, the fourth since Miss Marple's arrival, the storm returned in full. Rain lashed against the windows. The wind howled across the moor. Mrs. Henson begged her to stay inside, but Miss Marple was determined. "I believe tonight," she said, fastening her coat, "we may learn who waits by that gate." She took the inspector's borrowed torch and stepped into the storm. The air smelled of earth and thunder. Each gust pushed her back, but she pressed on until the faint golden glow appeared ahead. The lantern was already lit, and this time the figure did not run. A woman stood beside it, wrapped in a tattered cloak, her hair plastered to her face by the rain. Her hands clutched the gate as if she feared it might vanish. Miss Marple called softly, "Good evening." The woman turned sharply, startled, eyes wide with something between fear and hope. "Who are you?" she cried. "My name is Marple, and you, my dear, have been waiting a very long time." The woman stared at her. I thought if I lit the lantern, he would come back. Every night, I hoped he'd see it and know I was sorry." Miss Marple stepped closer. "You knew Mr. Lacey, then?" The woman nodded weakly. "His brother. I was his wife once. He told me to leave. I did, and I've regretted it every day since. But when I heard he died, I couldn't stay away." Miss Marple's expression softened. "You've been coming here since his death?" "Yes. I found the old lantern in the shed. I thought maybe his spirit could see it. Foolish, isn't it?" "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "Not foolish. Just very human." They stood there in silence as the rain fell around them. The lantern burned steadily, casting trembling light on the wet ground. Then Miss Marple said softly, "Mrs. Henson must know the truth. Come inside. Warm yourself. You need not hide any longer." The woman hesitated. "She'll hate me. I was the reason they quarreled." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Hate is rarely stronger than grief. Cool me." Together they walked up the path toward the house, two shadows moving through rain and memory. Inside, Mrs. Henson waited by the fire, her face pale when she saw the stranger. For a long moment, no one spoke. The sound of the storm filled the silence. Then Mrs. Henson whispered, "Helen." The woman nodded. "I didn't mean for you to be afraid. I only wanted him to forgive me." Tears rose in Mrs. Henson's eyes. She crossed the room and took her sister-in-law's trembling hands. "He already has," she said softly, "and now so have I." Miss Marple stepped back, watching as the two women embraced, their shadows merging in the flicker of the firelight. The lantern outside swayed gently in the storm, its purpose finally fulfilled. She smiled to herself. Human hearts, she thought, were much like lanterns, fragile things that burned brighter when tended and dimmed when left alone. And as she turned away from the window, she knew the mystery of the gate was not one of crime, but of love, regret, and the faint, stubborn light that never quite goes out. Chapter 3. The Shadows Across the Lawn. The rain had eased by morning, but the world outside Hawthorne Grange still seemed soaked in silence. Mist clung to the hedges and trees, softening every edge, as if the night itself refused to leave. Miss Marple stood by the drawing-room window, watching the fog drift across the lawn. Her teacup rested in both hands, still steaming faintly. Behind her, the fire crackled low, and somewhere upstairs the faint sound of footsteps echoed. Mrs. Henson moving about, her voice now calm and steady for the first time in days. The events of the night before had brought a kind of peace to the old house. Helen, the sister-in-law once thought long gone, had been given a room, dry clothes, and a meal by the hearth. She'd slept little, but when morning came, she seemed lighter, as though the burden she had carried through the rain had finally been set down. And yet, Miss Marple knew the air was not quite free of secrets. Peace, she thought, can be as deceptive as fog. It hides more than it reveals. After breakfast, Inspector Rowe arrived again. His coat was still damp from the weather, and his shoes left small marks on the tiled floor. "So it was the sister-in-law all along," he said, adjusting his notebook. "No harm meant, no law broken. I'll mark it as a resolved disturbance." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I wouldn't be too quick to close the book, Inspector. When one thread is pulled, others tend to come loose." Rowe gave a polite shrug. "I suppose you'll tell me what you mean." She looked toward the window, where the fog still pressed softly against the glass. Mrs. Henson believed she was alone in the house for months. Yet someone entered the cellar, took the lantern, and left no sign of entry. "I should like to know how that was possible." Rowe frowned. "You think someone else has been here?" "I think," Miss Marple said, setting her teacup down, "that houses remember more than people think. And Hawthorne Grange has a long memory." When Helen came down later, she looked pale but composed. She wore a borrowed dress and held her shawl loosely about her shoulders. "Thank you for letting me stay," she said quietly. "I'll be gone by tomorrow." "Nonsense," Mrs. Henson replied, setting a plate before her. "You'll stay until you've regained your strength. We've both been lonely long enough." Helen smiled, a small, grateful smile. But Miss Marple noticed her hands tremble slightly as she reached for the cup. The woman's eyes were weary, but behind them there was something else, fear. As they ate, Miss Marple watched closely. Helen flinched each time the floor creaked. Her gaze kept flicking toward the door, as though expecting someone to walk in uninvited. When breakfast was over, Miss Marple offered gently, "Would you join me for a short walk around the garden, my dear? The air may do you good." Helen hesitated, but agreed. The garden stretched behind the house, a tangle of hedges and stone paths half hidden by overgrown ivy. They walked slowly, the damp earth soft beneath their shoes. Miss Marple carried her small walking stick, tapping it lightly as they went. "You lit that lantern every night," she said softly, "yet you never entered the house until last evening." "Why?" Helen sighed. "I couldn't bear to. Every window reminded me of him. Every light made me feel unwelcome. I thought if I stayed by the gate, I could at least see home again, even from a distance." "You said you hoped he'd forgive you," Miss Marple said. "Forgive you for what?" Helen's hands tightened on her shawl. "For the quarrel. I told him I wanted to leave. I was foolish. I thought I could manage alone. When I came back, it was too late. He'd fallen ill. By the time I reached him, he was gone." Miss Marple stopped walking. "And yet," she said gently, "you still came back here night after night." "Yes," Helen whispered, "because I wanted peace. I wanted to feel near him again. But there's something else, something I didn't tell Clara." Miss Marple waited. Helen's voice dropped lower. "The last night I came, before you found me, I saw someone in the window upstairs. A man. I thought I was losing my mind, but I swear he was there, looking down at the lantern." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "A man, you say?" Helen nodded. "Tall, with dark hair. The light caught his face for only a moment. But I know what I saw." That afternoon, the inspector and his men searched the property again. They found no one. Every door was locked, every window latched. The cellar was empty but for the smell of damp wood and old oil. Still, Miss Marple's thoughts would not rest. She stood once more by the window that overlooked the gate, her mind piecing together quiet fragments. The footprints that had come from the forest, the lantern with its careful wick, the initials scratched into the metal, and now a man's shadow in the upstairs window. There was a pattern forming, one she recognized too well. In every mystery, she thought, truth moves like a whisper through the house, brushing against curtains, echoing through empty halls. It waits to be heard. At dusk, as the sky turned the color of fading roses, she asked Mrs. Henson a question. "When your husband passed, who handled his affairs?" Mrs. Henson looked puzzled. "The solicitor, of course. Mr. Ward. He came from the village. And who managed the house after? The accounts, the staff, the land? The gardener did, until he left. Then Mr. Ward said he'd send someone to look after the place, but no one ever came. Miss Marple's eyes softened. No one you saw, perhaps. That night, the wind returned. Not a storm this time, but a steady whispering through the trees. The clock struck 9. Miss Marple sat by the window once more. Helen had gone early to bed, and Mrs. Henson was asleep by the fire, her knitting still resting on her lap. The lantern was not lit tonight. For the first time since her arrival, the gate was dark. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt the quiet unease of something unfinished. Then, from somewhere beyond the garden, came the crunch of footsteps. Slow, careful, deliberate. Miss Marple rose silently, took her torch, and moved toward the back door. The air outside was cold and still. The moon had risen behind a veil of clouds, giving the world a dim, silvery glow. She followed the sound across the lawn, her shoes sinking slightly into the wet earth. The footprints led her toward the edge of the garden, toward the same break in the fence where she had found the torn shawl. But this time, the wire was bent back again. Someone had passed through. She stepped closer, shining her torch into the dark. There, half hidden behind the hedge, stood a man. He froze as the beam touched his face. He was gaunt, his clothes worn, his hair streaked with gray. His eyes flickered with the startled look of someone who had been seen for the first time in years. "Good evening," Miss Marple said softly. "You must be Mr. Lacey's brother." The man stared at her. "Who told you that?" "You did," she said gently. "Every step you've taken told me." He lowered his head. "I didn't mean to frighten anyone. I've been living in the woods. Couldn't face the law or the village after what happened." "You quarreled with your brother," Miss Marple said. "But not over money, as everyone believes." He looked up sharply. "How could you know that?" "Because guilt rarely hides behind greed," she said. "You argued because of Helen. You love her too, didn't you?" He closed his eyes. "I did. But she chose him. I tried to stay away, but when he fell ill, I came back. I wanted to see him, to tell him I was sorry. I saw him through the window that night, and then he was gone." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "And since then, you've been watching the house." "I saw the lantern," he whispered. "I thought it was him waiting for me. Every night it burned. I couldn't stay away." Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice kind but firm. "The light wasn't for you. It was Helen's sorrow, not forgiveness. But you've both been chasing ghosts, when what you need is truth." He looked toward the house, his eyes wet with rain and memory. "Does Clara know?" "Not yet," said Miss Marple. "But she must. Hiding in shadows never heals the wound." Together they walked back toward the gate. The lantern still hung there, unlit, but as they passed, Miss Marple reached up and touched the cool metal. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "a light must be extinguished before morning can come." Inside, the house was silent. Miss Marple guided the man into the drawing room. The fire had burned low, and Mrs. Henson stirred as they entered. When she saw him, her breath caught. "Edward." He bowed his head. "I am sorry, Clara, for everything." For a long time, she said nothing. Then she crossed the floor and placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "You should have come sooner," she said, her voice breaking. "We've all been living in the dark." Helen appeared at the door, pale and wide-eyed. When she saw Edward, she nearly stumbled. "You're alive." He looked at her gently. "I thought you'd never forgive me." Tears filled her eyes. "I've forgiven too many ghosts tonight to hold on to one more." Miss Marple watched them quietly, her hands folded. The three of them stood together in the dim glow of the fire, bound not by guilt now, but by the strange mercy that comes when the truth is finally spoken aloud. Outside, dawn was beginning to rise, pale light spreading over the wet grass. The lantern still hung by the gate, its glass dark but unbroken, waiting perhaps for one last light. Miss Marple turned toward the window, her reflection faint against the morning mist. She smiled to herself, a gentle, knowing smile. "The shadows," she murmured, "are always darkest before the day remembers itself." And as she watched the first sunlight touch the lawn, she knew the mystery was nearly over. But one question still waited to be answered. Because somewhere, buried beneath all the sorrow and forgiveness, lay one final truth about the night Mr. Lacey died. A truth the house had been holding on to, quiet and patient, just like the lantern by the gate. Chapter 4. The Light That Never Went Out. The dawn came softly over Hawthorne Grange, painting the mist a pale gold. But neither Miss Marple nor Inspector Rowe had slept. The events of the night before lingered like a bruise in the air. Mrs. Henson's frightened cry, the sudden figure by the gate, and that lantern still glowing defiantly against the storm. Rowe stood by the hearth, rubbing the back of his neck. "I've had men combing the fields since sunrise. Not a trace of anyone, Miss Marple. Just those same footprints coming from nowhere and going nowhere." Miss Marple poured a cup of tea, her hands steady as ever. "The footprints tell us plenty, Inspector. They stopped because their maker stopped coming by the gate." But the light continued. He frowned. "I don't follow." "You will," she said kindly, "when we find out who the message was truly meant for." Mrs. Henson appeared in the doorway, pale and drawn, as though she'd aged years overnight. "The lantern," she whispered. "It's gone again." Rowe straightened. "Gone?" "Yes. I looked from the window at dawn. It wasn't there. Someone must have taken it." Miss Marple looked toward the garden. The mist was thinning, the trees standing clear now. The gate was empty. The hook where the lantern had hung swayed slightly in the breeze. "Not taken," she murmured. "Returned." Rowe raised an eyebrow. "Returned where?" Miss Marple rose, smoothing the creases from her skirt. "To the place where it belonged. If you'll be so kind, Inspector, fetch your hat. We're going to the old chapel by the hill." The chapel sat half-hidden among the yews, its roof sagging, its door chained. Once it had been a family burial ground for the Laceys, long before the Grange changed hands. Miss Marple walked the path slowly, her shoes crunching the frost-bitten grass. At the far end of the small churchyard stood the gatekeeper's cottage, collapsed now, a skeleton of timbers and ivy. Beside its crumbling wall, something glimmered faintly. The lantern. It stood upright on the ground, still burning, its glass smeared with damp. Rowe approached it cautiously. "So this is where our ghost ends up." Miss Marple knelt beside it. "Not a ghost, Inspector, just a story that hasn't been told." She brushed the soot from its base. The letters C.H. were still there, but beneath them, faint and newly carved, was another mark, a date. March 12th, Miss Marple read aloud. "That was yesterday." Mrs. Henson's voice trembled. "That's my husband's death day. He died 2 years ago yesterday." Miss Marple looked at her gently. "You never told me that, my dear. Perhaps because you hadn't quite accepted it." Mrs. Henson's eyes filled. "It was an accident. He fell from the bridge when it gave way. They never found his body. They said the river carried him off." Rowe crossed his arms. "So whoever lit this lantern was marking the anniversary?" "Perhaps," said Miss Marple softly. "Or perhaps they were waiting for him to return." They carried the lantern back to the house, its flames still alive despite the wind. Miss Marple set it on the table, then opened her knitting bag. From it, she drew a small bundle, something she'd found in the cellar that morning. It was a handkerchief, neatly folded, embroidered with the same initials. "Sich." Rowe leaned closer. "Mrs. Henson's?" "No," said Miss Marple. "It's older thread, different stitching. A man's. Likely belonged to her husband." Mrs. Henson stared, bewildered. "But how could it be in the cellar?" "That was locked." Miss Marple gave her a long, thoughtful look. "Unless someone had a key." Mrs. Henson's expression shifted, confusion giving way to realization. "The gardener," she whispered. "Mr. Dykes. He worked for my husband for years. He left just after the first anniversary." "Did he ever speak of your husband's death?" Miss Marple asked. She nodded. "He said he blamed himself. He was meant to repair that bridge. But he never did." Roe exhaled sharply. "You think he's the one lighting the lantern?" Miss Marple's voice was calm. "Grief takes strange shapes, Inspector. He likely comes each year to mark the day, to say what he never said in life." By nightfall, the storm returned, washing the countryside in sheets of rain. Miss Marple sat by the window, her lamp unlit. The gate was a dark outline against the lightning flashes. She waited. 9:30. There it was, the faint glow of the lantern again. Someone stood beside it, a shadow barely visible through the rain. Roe whispered, "That's him." Miss Marple placed a hand on his arm. "Let him come closer. He means no harm." The figure lifted the lantern gently, almost reverently, and hung it on the gate. Then he turned to leave. "Mr. Dykes," Miss Marple called softly. He froze. The lightning showed his face, lined, tired, soaked through with rain. "I thought no one would care," he said hoarsely. "I lighted for him. For Mr. Henson. He was a good man. I failed him." Mrs. Henson stepped out from the porch, her shawl fluttering in the wind. "You didn't fail him, Thomas. He forgave you long ago. You've just been punishing yourself." The man's shoulders shook. "I couldn't leave it unlit. Not once. He used to say the gate light was the way home." The storm quieted, as if listening. Miss Marple spoke gently. "Then let it burn one last time tonight. But after that, you must let him rest. And yourself, too." He nodded slowly, his tears lost in the rain. Then, without another word, he walked down the lane and disappeared into the mist. Later that night, Miss Marple and Mrs. Henson stood together by the window. The lantern's flame danced softly, its glow reflected in their eyes. Mrs. Henson's voice was barely a whisper. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, "because it burns for love, not guilt. And that, my dear, is the only light that never truly goes out." They watched until the wick flickered low and the last spark faded into darkness. Hawthorne Grange was silent again, but the silence was peaceful now. The house, it seemed, had finally exhaled. The next morning, as Miss Marple prepared to leave, Inspector Roe walked her to the cab. "Strange business that," he said, "all over a bit of light at the gate." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Most mysteries, Inspector, begin with something small. A lantern, a letter, a whisper. It's what people hide behind them that matters most." He tipped his hat. "You've got a sharp mind, ma'am. Can't imagine what we'd do without you." "Oh, I'm sure you'd manage," she said, stepping into the cab, though perhaps not quite as neatly. The cab pulled away. The road wound through the mist, and behind her, Hawthorne Grange shrank to a shadow among the trees. Miss Marple watched the gate vanish from view. The hook was empty now, but for a moment she thought she saw a faint glimmer, just a memory of light refusing to die. She smiled to herself. "Some lights," she murmured, "are never meant to go out." If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss another Miss Marple story. Every lantern has a secret, and the next one might just reveal itself in our next case. Stay curious and keep the light burning.